We haven't spoken much about Washington, D.C. recently, have we? Which might be a relief to some of you, but here's an interesting story, and it's to do with the new appointments to the new administration under President Joe Biden. One of his top picks includes the appointment of Alejandro Mayorkas, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. He was approved by the Senate, sworn in by VP Kamala Harris. And what's interesting is his family background and, of course, the job that he's going to end up doing, an immigration job. I've been finding out more about him from Hugo Lowell, who's a US political reporter and contributor for Politico.
Mayorkas is a former Deputy Secretary at the Department of Homeland Security and a former Director of Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the Department of Homeland Security's legal immigration agency. He's also best known for helping develop DACA, which is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which essentially deferred deportation for hundreds of thousands of young immigrants who are brought illegally to the US as children.
And that enormously controversial as well under the Trump years. Obviously, his background as the son of Cuban immigrants as well is important. Is that something that's being played up? The symbolism of having, the child of migrants in charge of the Department for Migration?
Yeah, I think so. Mayorkas is the first Latino and first immigrant to hold the role. I think it really underscores the Biden administration's commitment to having a diverse cabinet, one that I think tries to reflect the broad coalition of voters that sent Biden to the White House in the first place. There's enormous symbolism with this. Biden's been very big on diversity and trying to bring the country together, different minorities, different ethnic backgrounds.
Is he, Mayorkas, actually a liberal or a dove, however we want to describe it, on immigration issues? Because, of course, Obama's administration only seems liberal in comparison to the Trump administration. There were many campaigners in the area who used to describe Obama as the deporter-in-chief and thought that they were unreasonably harsh and hardline on migration. But if he was developing DACA, do we assume that he is a liberal in these affairs?
I think it's difficult to tell, as you pointed out. Normally, the way we look at this is to compare it to previous administrations, and the Trump administration was very hardline against immigration. They basically had a whole number of policies that effectively made it impossible for people to seek asylum in the US, and a really hard stance on deportations and family separation. So I think anything that the Biden administration and Mayorkas does is going to be seen in that light. And I think for that reason, it will be viewed across the spectrum as fairly liberal, and certainly among the Republican contingent in Congress.
How did the Republicans divide on this? It's a Senate approval that's required, 56 to 43, fewer Republicans going with him.
I think he was about right. The vote really reflected the deep skepticism of many Republicans in the Senate. Only 6 Republicans actually voted for him, and they really weren't surprises at all. I mean, Mitt Romney, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, these are people who are no fan of Trump's hardline immigration policies. And so the vote really came down, as one might expect, but I think it might highlight the difficulties that immigration is going to pose from a legislative standpoint going forward.
Of course, it's not only an immigration brief, it's also got to take on what I suppose is becoming an ever bigger issue, particularly since the Capitol riot, that of so-called domestic terrorism. That's his brief as well. How important is that?
I've been speaking to a number of Biden aides and congressional aides over the course of the last week, and they unequivocally tell me that domestic terrorism is going to be priority in the in-tray for Mayorkas. I think domestic terrorism really came into sharp relief during the Capitol attack on January 6th. And I think the DHS was set up in the aftermath of 9/11 to track mainly foreign terror threats at the time. But as the FBI now says, domestic terrorism is now the number one threat to national security. And that's something Mayorkas is going to have to grapple with from the outset.
And Mayorkas is someone who is of Biden's thinking? Or are we going to see sort of, the internal ructions that we were looking at this time one administration ago?
I think a lot of the secretaries and nominees are going to be in lockstep with Biden. It's going to be really important, especially with a narrow majority in the Senate for Democrats, even though they control the majority. But, the other thing is the Trump administration's record with the DHS was really tumultuous.
Certainly was. That was Hugo Lowell of Politico, giving us the background to the appointment of the new head or secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas.